Today, I'm going to talk about people I despise, and obviously, these people are not real people. But my anger with these people is absolutely real anger. Hello everyone, it is time for another ranking list video. This time I am going through my favorite antagonists, and I'm doing my top 7. And you might be like, well, why 7? And it's because I really think of my favorite antagonists, these are the ones I wasn't willing to not have on the list. So it's just 7 because there's a somewhat decent sized gap between 7 and whatever 8 is. So I am going to have some honorable mentions, but I really felt like I was going to do top 5, but I felt like these two at the bottom kind of earned their spot and were closer to the 5 above them than the rest of the honorable mentions. And I am going to preface right away that this is going to be a mix of spoilery and non-spoilers. So I'm going to tell you right away which numbers are spoilers and what series they spoil and to what degree, and then I will have timestamps for every number. So, number 6 is a spoiler for Malazan Book of the Fallen up to Midnight Tides. If you have finished Midnight Tides, you can watch 6. If you have not finished Midnight Tides, you're gonna have to skip that one. I'll have a spoiler-free section at the start, which I'll also timestamp where I say... Actually, I can't even say who it is, so you'll just have to skip that one. Number 4 is a spoiler for the First Law trilogy. Not for the entire First Law world. If you have finished the last Argument of Kings, you can watch that. Once again, this is one where even saying the name would be a spoiler, and I will, since it's a spoiler anyways, be talking about the spoilery ones in spoilery detail. So if you have not read the First Law trilogy, you've not finished the last Argument of Kings, you're going to want to skip number 4. And then number 2 is spoilers for the Stormlight archive, up to the end of Rhythm of War. So if you are not completely caught up, and once again, I can't even say the name without it being a spoiler. So if you are not caught up with the Stormlight archive, you are going to have to skip from 3 to 1, which is not a spoiler. So I'm going to have that timestamped, so this way I do not spoil anyone. But I think some of these I don't have to talk about in spoilers, so I didn't want to spoiler any of them, but I just wanted to make that clear. Okay, next, criteria for what I think makes a really good villain. Because I think there are kind of 3 things that most good villains are at least one of them. Or, I mean, most of the time a villain is trying to be at least one. And then I think most of the really good villains are like at least 2, and some are 3. And the first 2 are how good they are at being the role of a villain, which is, are they hateable or are they intimidating? And like the number 1 example of a hateable villain I can think of is Umbridge from Harry Potter. Everyone hates Umbridge. She sucks. And intimidating would be Darth Vader from the first Star Wars movie. Like, just the presence he has. The third criteria is really just how good of a character they are, which is, like, villains who are complex and understandable. Which, obviously, like, being complex and multifaceted is good for every character, while for some characters it's not good. Like, it'd be weird for them to be hateable or intimidating. All 3 of these are going to be a consideration. Now, I'm not going to have, like, any point system. I'm just ranking these based on which are my favorite. But I am going to talk about, like, what factors I think they excel at. So, with the preface done, let us get in to my number 7 pick for great fantasy or sci-fi, although I believe all of these are fantasy. So, just fantasy antagonists. Coming in the number 7 spot, a woman who was originally an honorable mention, but it just felt wrong having her as an honorable mention, and it is Ait Mada from the Greenbone Saga, the booktube fan favorite trilogy by Fondaly that I read last year. And Ait Mada, I think, is a great example of an antagonist where she's the antagonist to a story that, like, could be told from either side. Like, there absolutely could have been a trilogy where she was the protagonist and like, Hilo and, like, our other main protagonists were, like, the main antagonists. But also, despite her probably being reasonable, I was definitely cheering against her. And, like, what else can I say? Like, Amana's a badass. Her presence, like, just looms over this entire trilogy. And she's just intimidating enough that she inspires, like, a sense of dread. Because it just feels like if you look at things analytically, it's going to be really hard to beat her. But she's also... She doesn't do this by being, like... Feel like if she was a protagonist, she would also be like a flawed and complex character. Really excellent antagonist, and probably, I think, one of the main reasons Greenbone is as compelling as it is. I think as good as the protagonist and main cast were, if the villain was not, or maybe villain's the wrong word, the opposing force, the foil, was not as compelling and intimidating as she was, this series would not have hit as hard as it does. I think she's not super hateable. Like, I don't really hate her, but she's definitely extremely intimidating and quite complex. So that's those are, I think every villain I have here, every antagonist, hits, like, at least two of those, and those would, I think, be the two that she hits the most. And yeah, so she earns her spot on this list. And we move on to the number 6 spot, and I want to remind you, the timestamp does say this, but this is going to be spoilery for Midnight Tides by Steven Erikson, and because the name is kind of a spoiler, I'm actually just going to talk about him in full spoilers for Midnight Tides. I'm not going to talk about anything past Midnight Tides, but if you have not finished Midnight Tides, you may skip ahead to the timestamp for number 5, which... yeah. It's in the bottom. I've got it both in the description, and there should be, like, the bar against the bottom. Okay. Midnight Tides, for those of you who've read Midnight Tides, it's probably pretty obvious. I mean, Rulad, the younger brother of Troll Sengar. And this is my favorite Malazan antagonist, somewhat comfortably, partially because I love the family drama. I think Erikson is really good at family drama, and this is such an Erikson classic character because it's a character who does some things that are just really despicable, but also it's someone you just feel, or at least I just felt, horrible for. And I think if Erikson is if he's almost trying to do one thing, it's inspiring compassion in people who traditionally someone might say you don't deserve compassion, but Erikson would say, everyone deserves compassion, and I think two of my favorite, like, this character is one of the main reasons why, like, the Troll, Rulad, Udinas Fear plot of Midnight Tides is my favorite single book plot in Malazan Book of the Fallen by a pretty comfortable margin. I really love the way Troll, who is, obviously Rulad's brother, and Udinas, who has no real relationship with Rulad and is actually just, like, a slave and is even lower down on, like, the totem pole of slaves, think about Rulad, because Troll tends to, when he's thinking about the horrible things happening with Rulad, tends to think about that in the context of, this is going to be bad for the people of Lether, because if the ruler is going insane as he repeatedly experiences painful deaths, that's going to be bad for the people he's ruling. Udinas is actually thinking of him like, holy crap, this poor guy had a bunch of metal, died, and a bunch of times it has a bunch of metal coins burned to his body. And when the Udinas gets kind of possessed and gets taken away, you can see how quickly things collapse. And I really love how, basically, it's such an Erikson moment, but the compassion of one effectively nameless, or if I'm going to be all Erikson-y, one unwitnessed, the compassion of one unwitnessed slave held together an empire, because as soon as that Udinas was gone, things fell apart again right away. And it's like things were falling apart, and then Udinas actually kind of righted the ship, and then he got taken away, and boom, it's gone. So, I love that plot line. I love Rulad, even though I hate Rulad, cause screw Rulad, but he's one of my favorite Malazan Book of the Fallen characters. I think he has he's not that intimidating just because he's kind of a screw up, but he's definitely has moments that make him hateable, but he's also one of the most, like, understandable and complex villains on this list. Probably, I don't know, I think actually all of these characters on this list are pretty complex, but he definitely is one of them. And I was going to have him as an honorable mention, but I just couldn't. I wanted to have him actually on the list proper, because he is an honorable mention. I couldn't have even said his name. It would have been like, honorable mention, a spoilery person from Midnight Tides. You can probably figure out who it is. But anyway, he definitely earns his spot here as my favorite antagonist in the series and one of the best antagonists in the entire genre. And coming into the people who were actually originally on my top 5 list, we have number 5, Brandon of Ygrath from Tigana, the most famous and popular book from Guy Gavriel Kay, this is not my favorite Guy Gavriel Kay book. I like 4 others more, but this is, I still think, comfortably my favorite Guy Gavriel Kay antagonist, and a huge part of the premise of the story. And for those who don't know, the premise of the story actually basically would involve this guy, because after he kind of conquered half of the peninsula of the Palm, and in some of the final battles, one of the last nations that was holding out, Tigana, ended up killing his son in one of the battles, and he was, pretty upset about that. Like, it was kind of a pointless battle anyways. They weren't going to win. And in his anger, he not only did some pretty terrible things, but he also used sorcery to destroy the memory of Tigana. So those who live in Tigana at the time can still remember, like, the name and the culture of the place, but no one else can remember anything about the nation. So as the people who are alive slowly die away, they will have to watch, like, the knowledge of their land disappear. And yeah, so that's not a very nice thing to do. And there's one of the main protagonists of this book, Dianara, who's the secondary protagonist, who you meet later in the book, and is my favorite character in this book. Adds so many layers to this antagonist. He's definitely less on the intimidating or hateable scale and more on the complex scale. I think probably the only more complex, multifaceted antagonist on this list is the person in number 1. But for complexity, I would probably take Brandon over anyone else here. I think he might not be, I don't particularly hate him. He is intimidating, but he doesn't quite, strike fear the way some of the others do. But he definitely does have an intimidating presence, both due to his personality and due to his, just straight-up abilities. He's an extremely powerful sorcerer in a book where magic is quite rare. And I also really like how we see the various different perspectives on him. The 2 main protagonists will both... One just kind of thinks of him actually just as an antagonist. The other, Dianora, actually thinks of him as a person. And the way they think of him is just so contrasting, and I think adds to his character. And he does earn the number 5 spot on this list. Okay, this might be feeling a little bit repetitive, but this is a spoilery section for the First Law Trilogy. Even the name is spoilery, because when you first meet him, you're not going to know that he's an antagonist. So, if you have not finished The Last Argument of Kings, I'm going to get you to skip to number 3. Anyways, it's probably pretty obvious, again, as it was for Malazan, for those who have read the First Law Trilogy, that I'm talking about Bayaz, the first of the Magi, who is a person who, you don't really see how ruthless he is at first, and I think it's because for the first books, and again, I'm going to spoil things here, for the first book or 2 that we see him, we're generally seeing him from Logan's perspective, and Logan is kind of just going on with what he's doing, because Logan is kind of like, I've tried running my life, and that went horribly, so I'm just going to be this guy, just follow this guy. And he's not, people are just agreeing with him and going along. But when people start to disagree with him and try and oppose him, that's where you see how damn ruthless this guy is. The conversation he has with Jazal at the end of The Last Argument of Kings, where he's just like, I bought you from, a prostitute. She asked for, 20 coins, but I drive a hard bargain and I got you for 6. that entire last Argument of Kings is just like, holy crap, how ruthless this guy is. And also, his level of patience. I think patient antagonists are more intimidating than me. They're not going to go out in a blaze of glory. He's not going to mistake. He's not going to make a mistake and overplay his hand. You get the feel that he's just going to play it the smart way. Now, it's kind of weird because he has such a feeling of inevitability that he'll win. But he actually got really lucky in the first trilogy to win it all. But it still just feels inevitable that he's going to just be so hard to defeat. And things like that he'll just win in the end because he'll keep trying. And he'll just be patient and relentless. And he's definitely... I don't know how much I hate him. I definitely dislike him at times. But he would definitely be, again, very intimidating. Like, when he enters the screen, when he enters stage, you're just like, oh crap, it's Baez, once you kind of know what's going on with him. Also, just a great idea for a character. For those who don't know, this was inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, who said that if Lord of the Rings was like an analogy for World War II, then Gandalf would have used the ring. And Joe Abercrombie was just like, that sounds like something I could do. Anyways, love this guy, and by love him, I mean he sucks and I hate him. But we are going to move on to my top 3. We are moving on to my top 3 spot, which is a series that I have read many, many, many times. And this one is definitely not a spoiler that he's an antagonist, because you can tell from his first line, he's not a good dude. He is one of the most chilling first lines I have ever seen. And it is Nicodemus from the Dresden Files, first introduced in Death Masks. And so this isn't a spoiler, but I'm just going to say it anyways. But his first line is, "Cannot hurt you anymore," said the central shape in a quietly amused male voice. No matter how many times I hear that one, it's always a fresh challenge. He gives the sense that he's playing a different game from all these other people Dresden has faced. And he also keeps getting better. He is a man who is possessed by a fallen angel, but it's debatable who's really running that relationship. You would think Fallen Angel would have the edge, but this man is old. He has been around for a long time, and he is, I think, by far my favorite Dresden Files pure antagonist. I think Dresden Files has stronger, frenemies than it has antagonists, and there might be one frenemy who I prefer to Nicodemus, but for the pure antagonists, he's easily my favorite, and he just keeps getting better. Even though him and Harry are generally being a bit stabby, or trying to murder each other, they do have dialogue between them, and, find me a better dialogue between a protagonist and antagonist than Harry's various dialogue with Nicodemus. It's otherworldly good. And he just, his entire way he carries himself, it's kind of similar to the last guy, but a little colder. Just very patient, very practical, and very ruthless. Where basically, he almost kind of enjoys, being the bad guy, but also he isn't going to let enjoyment getting in the way of winning. And he's someone despite that, he feels like he's actually a real person who's acting off real motives, and he's not just being the way he is to screw people up. I'm obviously not going to talk about that in more detail, because this is one of the not spoilery sections, but, man, screw this dude. He's such a good antagonist. He's such good, he has such presence, despite being visually the least intimidating protagonist. He has kind of a moderate, somewhat slight build, a soft voice, but he just, the way you get the feeling that the way he carries himself, despite the fact that you can't see him because he's in his book, and he just comes across as someone who already knows how he's gonna win. And so yeah, he gets up to the number 3 spot on this list. So we are going to move up to number 2, which is going to be Stormlight Archive spoilers. So, okay, this is the time where if your phone's in your pocket or something playing in the background, this is your chance to either press the off button or turn it off and go to spot number 1, which is not a spoiler, because this is going to be spoilers for Stormlight Archives, and the name is going to be a spoiler for, like, Way of Kings, but I'm just going to talk about him for full spoilers for Rhythm of War. A lot of people have read Stormlight anyways. Alright, that's it. Your time ends now. Alright, obviously, it's Taravangian. Easily the best Brandon antagonist. Like, he's so good. I think for maybe, like, Elantris and early in his career, Antagonist could have been, like, arguably one of Brandon's weaknesses. And now he actually has a lot. I guess it's not all, because Rhythm of War itself has, like, 3 straight fire antagonists. With, you know, you got Vyre, you got Raboniel, and you got this dude, Taravangian. Like, this man is physically by far the weakest villain on this list. He's actually, like, decrepit. Like, he would probably lose a physical fight to, like, a teenager. And this is, like, the first villain who I think is strong in all 3. Like, he's so intimidating. He inspires a sense of dread more than basically any other antagonist I've read. In Oathbringer, you've got the part where Dalinar is trying to get allies to join him. And I think it's Navani is like, oh, we had someone who joined. And Dalinar's like, oh, and Navani's like, Taravangian. And Dalinar's like, yeah, good, we can always count on Taravangian. And meanwhile, the reader's just like, ah! No, please stop. Please stop. Also, like, in his conversations, Taravangian is so convincing. And this is one thing I generally absolutely love about the Stormlight Archive, is even when you have a character who is almost the antithesis to the primary themes of the Stormlight Archive. Like, he's very Machiavellian, very utilitarian, which is like, it's the one thing, like, Stormlight, it's like, the life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination is basically, that's bad. But he doesn't feel strawmanned at all. He actually feels like if you would took someone who was like a utilitarian and you got him to read the dialogue with Taravangian, a utilitarian would be like, this is an excellent representation of what I actually think. Despite Brandon clearly thinking this character, and I think he does this a lot, where he steelmans the various positions, where there will be people who disagree about things, and he will have all of them not feel like cut-out versions of those beliefs and provide, like, the strongest versions of those beliefs. And I think that is in display the strongest in Taravangian. Because, like, there are conversations where it's like he actually comes close. He's, like, very convincing. And also just the premise for Taravangian, an old man whose intelligence and compassion randomizes every day with inverse correlation between the two, has to be one of the most creative examples of a fantasy antagonist. Well, for an antagonist that I have ever seen. And it's also a great example of a character who could only exist in a fantasy book. I guess there have been a couple of those. But you could have someone, personality-wise, who is similar to the others. The main premise of Taravangian is something that can only exist in fantasy. Like, you can't have Taravangian if you're not in a fantasy book. And it's one of the reasons I love the genre. So, I forgot, it's Stormlight, and I get to hold up the leather bound. Hey, check out these books. They're so sick. If Subterranean Press or Folio made these, they would have cost $3,000. So, they were expensive, but getting them from Dragonsteel was way, way, way less expensive than getting them from any of these other presses, and they live up in quality. So, yay for anniversary editions, yay for Stormlight, and let's move on to number 1. Hey, I tricked you. You thought I was going to number 1, but I was lying. Because me from 20 seconds ago forgot there are honorable mentions. Because actually, there's a bunch of them. And actually, some of them are sci-fi. 3 of them are sci-fi. For honorable mentions, I'm including this is not in order. I'm mentioning the sci-fi ones first. But the Jackal from Red Rising, who I think is a more interesting character than Darrow. Who I'm not going to talk that much about the honorable mentions. But the Jackal from Red Rising makes it. Siriani Dorayeka from the Sun Eater. Damn, Cielson is hard to speak. And then the other is the Shrike, which isn't really a person, but is kind of a thing, and is just one of the most horrifying things that I have read. And next we have my cat, who is absolutely an antagonist in personality. She's extremely self-centered. She really cares about herself more than anyone else. But also is very likable. and I'm definitely cheering for her. So really, really good antagonist. We also have Invidia Aquitaine from Codex Alera, another series by Jim Butcher. That's my favorite antagonist from that series. We have Moradin from The Wheel of Time, who, if you're early into Wheel of Time, you haven't met him yet. There's like 6 other Hob antagonists. I guess I wrote this after I'd already written who one is, but you could probably, if you know books I like, you can probably guess who number 1 is. I guess if you haven't read the series, you won't know, but you'll find out shortly. I don't know if I include Regal as an honorable mention. I hate Regal, but I don't think he's quite as hateable or complex as some of the later Hob antagonists. Even Kyle, I think, is actually quite a bit more complex as a character and is more hateable. The Pale Woman is horrible. Dwalia, also horrible. Even the Duke of Chalced from the Rain Wilds. And I guess I'd include Regal as an honorable mention just because of how much I absolutely hate his guts. And I did enjoy him more as a character a little bit more on reread. I still have to reread Assassin's Quest. We got the Lord Ruler as Mistborn, who I'm not going to talk about that much, but the reason I find him enjoyable kind of changes throughout the series. We got Tywin Lannister from A Song of Ice and Fire, who I think I like more as an antagonist than the antagonists who are more like purely hateable, like Joffrey or Ramsay, who I don't think are super complex, to be completely honest. I think Tywin, though, also inspires rage and emotion, but has a level of intimidation that the others don't, and also a level of complexity that the others don't. Speaking of people who I just purely hate, Lycos from Faithful and the Fallen, please nerf grappling hooks. And yeah, that's going to be all my honorable mentions for this top 5 list that turned into a top 7. But I guess I should put the cat down now and stop recording. And in the number 1 spot, a spot that some of you might be a little bit confusing, but once you hear what series it's from, it'll make a lot of sense if you've read that series. This one is not a spoiler, and the number 1 spot is also from the First Law trilogy, Stairs. That is right. If you do not understand this, you're going to just have to go read the First Law trilogy, and you're going to have to get to the first Glocta chapter, and it'll all be self-explanatory. This is the main antagonist for definitely the first book, and it does return periodically throughout the world, and this is an antagonist that just, when it returns, just inspires dread. No, I'm kidding. I'm not actually doing this. Okay, here's my real number 1. Okay, number 1, who's it gonna be? This is not a curveball, and I do want to say this is number 1 by far. Like, way ahead of everyone else. I had to think about some spots here. I found really hard to order 3, 4, and 5, and I also found it really hard to order 6 and 7. 2 was pretty far above the rest, and 1 is easily my favorite antagonist. Probably almost first for all 3 categories. Maybe not intimidation, but he's one of the most hateable antagonists ever, and I think he's the most psychologically complex character I've ever read, and in the genre. And it is Kennet from the live ship Traders, who, unlike a lot of these other antagonists, is like a main POV character. But this is not a spoiler. It's kind of obvious he sucks. From his first chapter, which is chapter 1, where he thinks things like, he had a piece of somewhat magical artwork made, and he was like, the person who made it had their tongue cut off so they couldn't say anything about any of the information I revealed, which he was kind of like, I don't think that was really effective because he can communicate in other ways, but I appreciated the gesture, which if that tells you he thinks differently. He's a completely unique character to be in the head of. I've never read any POV that is even remotely like Kennet, where he manages to, at one time, like all of Hobbs' characters, feel extraordinarily human and flawed and complex and believable, while also just feeling off. He doesn't quite get the morality of other people. He's not someone who has no moral code. He absolutely does have an actually rather strict moral code. It's just, it's off. It's just tilted. It's surreal. It's a little bit off. And yeah, he tops the charts for hateability and complexity. he's not quite my favorite character in the live ship traders just because he sucks, but I think he's the most complex character. It's his interactions was like, if this story was told like more traditionally, where the antagonist wasn't one of the main, or one of the antagonists was not one of the main POVs, it would read like almost completely differently because of how different of an impression we would get of this character if we were only in other people's point of view. Like, the look he gives to outside to other people is so different from what's going on in my head, and it actually tricks me. It tricks me when I'm in other people's perspective and they're interacting with Kenneth, despite the fact that I'm in Kenneth's head all the time and I know how full of crap he is. Like, yeah, he's easily number one here. I think he's the best antagonist in the genre. This one was not hard. He'd get absolutely full points for hateability and complexity, and still quite a few points for intimidation, although I would say some of the people below, I would say kind of, when they get mentioned or enter a scene, feel maybe inspires slightly more dread, but still quite a bit of dread is inspired. Quite a bit of tension is inspired, and he's... I didn't even mention at the start, I was trying to do one per author. I don't know if it would change not doing one per author. The list might look the same. It isn't like protagonists or like just characters in general, where if it wasn't one per author, like half the list would be Hob. But Hob still gets the one spot on this list comfortably, like without breaking a sweat. And that is it. Those are my, well, I mentioned a lot of people, but the 7 people I mentioned in most detail who are my favorite antagonists, both for how they play the role as antagonist and just how I think well written they are as characters, and just my personal faves. So, obviously, if you're going to talk about any of the people that I had in spoiler sections, please spoiler tag your comments. So just write down what you're spoiling, and then press enter like 10 times. And then you can comment whatever you want. I don't like having to delete comments that aren't spam, but I will be deleting comments that spoil things, because as much as I feel bad deleting contributions, because I read every comment, and I do like the comments. I'm happy when my videos get lots of comments, because I like the interaction. I can't just have people get spoiled if they go to the comment section, so consider it a spoiler-free zone. But anyways, I'm curious to know where you guys agree with me and where you guys disagree, and who would be, are there any antagonists that you think that I'm reading soon that could have potential to join this? And are there any that you think I might have missed from people that I've read that you think deserve to get this spot? Let me know. Have a nice day, everyone.